I made a video a short while back speaking on how some big brain historian or cultural commentator will say every year without fail that the situation across the world is synonymous with the situation right before World War II. The implication always is that we're on the verge of World War III. Now, given this never happens, I take it with a large pinch of salt these days. I just don't think people are going to be motivated to go out and fight for their nation like the people were 100 years ago. After all, what nations are they fighting for? Most of our nations have been taken over by globalist liberalism. Further to that, modern forms of warfare are so advanced I don't really think you'd have standing armies, so we're unlikely to see a world war in the same mould as World War I and II now. But there's a reason people always hark back to World War II, and that's because in liberal modernity it demarcates the cultural mythology. This mythology states something like, at the beginning of the 20th century, you had strong national identification and extremist ideologies. Globalist liberalism won, and now we only have to get rid of our own, quote-unquote, hatred of the other in order to build a utopia. Now, this mythology creeps into every area of modern life, but perhaps none more so than the conversation around immigration. If anybody says anything even mildly critical of immigrants or immigration, someone, especially on the BBC, will inevitably bring up Nazi Germany and accuse you of being a crypto-Nazi.
Recently, I went to the Holocaust Centre just outside of Newark, and it was a real wake-up call because the Germany in the 1930s, they were suffering economic difficulties because of the reparations of the First World War. And these people were desperate and was looking for something to improve their life. And somebody would say, look, the problem with our society is the Jews. That's what's causing the problem. We will blame the Jews because they are ruining our country. Go forward now to this country. We are now blaming migrants. We are blaming immigrants for the ways in which our society is run.
So we all know what's coming here, don't we? This is going to be the typical, cliched leftist midwit opinion. Hitler blamed the Jews for the state of Germany. Jews are minorities, so if you notice anything wrong with minorities in the West, you're literally Hitler.
Migrants, illegal or legal, weren't responsible for austerity. That was the Conservative government. Migrants and illegals were not responsible for Brexit. Migrants were not responsible for Liz Truss's failure as leadership.
What relevance does any of this have, and who is claiming they are responsible for these things?
And don't forget, because those populist policies in the 30s.
See how he links populism with Nazi National Socialism seamlessly, and of course the BBC Question Time host doesn't make any effort to correct him, as I'm sure she would if someone made a link between, say, liberal parties and communism.
A certain Adolf Hitler was elected. And if we follow the same rhetoric, the same blaming of migrants...
This guy cannot be serious. He's actually doing the meme. If you complain about immigration, you're literally Hitler.
We will go in the same way. And the future of that path is very, very bleak.
Now, for such a stupid, sophomoric, illogical take, what response do you think this gets from the Question Time objective audience? Alistair Campbell, why is he clapping along? He killed about 1 million people in Iraq. He's nobody to talk about the treatment of non-whites. Now, we all know the point this guy is trying to make. We probably all thought the same when we were 17 and imbibing Noam Chomsky. It's run-of-the-mill leftist belief that right-wing quote-unquote parties make a mess in their own countries and then find an easy scapegoat like immigrants because they're simply evil and full of hate and white privilege and yada yada yada. Yet there is an obvious flaw in all of this, and that's what a Western nation's supposed to do then. Completely ignore immigration, pretend it's endlessly perfect, even though we've had 1.5 million people in the last 2 years when the country's already completely stretched. Are we supposed to ignore the sense of cultural erosion, that people are now minorities in their cities and towns, and maybe a minority in their own country in a few decades? The grooming gangs, terror attacks, the sense that the streets are now increasingly violent. The answer to all that in the liberal mind is yes, you have to ignore all of that because you're a crypto-Nazi who's making it all up because you're full of hate. In order to understand this, we have to go back to the concept I talk a lot about on this channel of progressive moral moral theology. In progressive moral theology, Hitler is Satan. White people are evil. They're prone to genocides. The Second World War proved that. And the good people are minorities. Ergo, to prove yourself as a good person in white liberal Western society, you must be relentlessly pro-immigration, pro-diversity, always pro-minorities, no matter the reality of the situation, because that's how you become a Puritan. This is why liberals cannot believe their lying eyes and ever admit there are any downsides to immigration. To do so would be a tacit acceptance that their soul has turned to evil, that they've somehow been taken over by some crypto-Nazism. Now, I understand maybe some liberals just want to be nice and good people, and I can sympathise with that, but the problem with this is, in the broader context, is it's completely nuts. That's because in life, you're much better off trying to get as close as you can to the truth rather than being fixated on progressive utopian ideology. This is because if you ignore fundamental truths about life, they will come back and hit you tenfold. In essence, this fella who's acting like the lovely leftist, who's worried about the scapegoating of migrants and Nazi Germany, is actually creating a neo-fascist figure. That's because if you shut down rational criticisms of immigration, as this fella is trying to do, as well as the BBC, via obvious emotional manipulation, what it means is these very important issues which are bothering millions of people never get spoken about. If you try and speak about them, you're called a fascist. And what that means is, eventually, some neo-fascist does rise up and is saying things that are true because the liberal mainstream won't, and then people will start being sympathetic to such a figure. In essence, what progressive moral theology seeks to destroy, that is fascism, it will ultimately recreate. That's because it's in the same moral universe. If you want to break free of that, you move to our broader tradition, the ancient tradition of Western culture. That's bigger than communism, socialism, fascism, and liberalism all put together. A return to that puts us back in the real moral universe, which is free of all these silly ideologies, which in my view just make a lot of mess. Anyway, do let me know what you think down below, and do consider subscribing to the channel if you're new.